My name is Steve Krevisky, everybody, and would like to welcome you to this important webinar, Moving the Money from the Military to Meet Human Needs. And it's sponsored by the Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition. And I think we're going to have a good program for you today. Just a couple of remarks before I call on Danny to moderate. We came together several years ago and concerned about the militarism, the US wars of aggression, the bloated military budget that takes away from so many human needs at home that we'll hear about from our presenters a little later. We also want to say that we also do not support the violence that occurred at the Capitol this week. It's a dangerous trend for a lot of reasons, and we think it also reflects the militarist approach to solving problems, if you want to call it that, the US aggression abroad and the attacks against Black Lives Matters protesters. And so what we want to be able to do is to slash the bloated war budget and meet human needs at home, of which there are many. So welcome everybody. We think this will be a good program. And at the end of the program, I'll come on to close things. So we hope that we can come up with some action steps today about how do we oppose the war machine, use the money to meet human needs. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Danny Sjursen. Is that the right pronunciation?
It's Sjursen, but I answer to any conglomeration of consonants.
I'm sorry?
I said it's Sjursen, but I answer to any
Sjursen,
crazy.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found out he's a fellow Yankee fan, so I approve. And so without further ado, Danny, as a member of Vets for Peace, an important constituency, Danny, please get us started. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me with such a great cast of, speakers and presenters today. And so the opportunity to kind of lead it off and close out and moderate is a real honor. This conference, this webinar is happening at obviously a pretty profound moment. I think it was profound before the madness and insurrectionism and violence that has been going on in the Capitol. But if anything, this sort of highlights it. I personally really like the focus and the title of this event, right? Moving Connecticut's economy from war to peace, practical public actions. Why do I like that? Well, it does things that most mainstream discussion does not, right? In a variety of media and elsewhere, which is it bridges the local, the national, and the global. I mean, I think there is some truth to the old adage, the old trope that all politics, perhaps all anti-war, anti-militarist activism is local, because it connects that. And the truth, the real truth that's always been there and few people want to look at is that the military industrial complex, the war industry, the gun running, the arms dealing, of which the United States leads the world, has always been purposefully, deliberately dug into local districts like ticks, making sure that you can't build, a money trap, right? A money pit of a system, unless you were building it in a whole bunch of districts. So there's state level activism that needs to be done. I've worked with Massachusetts Peace Action about Raytheon and a whole bunch of other things. And so I think it's really great. I think the truth is also that this webinar has a systemic focus. And it's not afraid to use words like militarism, and the speakers that we have are hitting that from so many different angles, experiences, and their own scholarship. No one wants to use words like empire oftentimes. No one wants to use words like militarism and systemic cultural and political militarism. Maybe this is some form of penance the last few years of my life, but I was a longtime water carrier for the said empire. That's who I am. That's the reality. And I was late awoken to some of these issues. And I don't need to give my full bio except to say that for 17 years, I did everything that the Army wanted me to do. And on paper, I was one of their golden boys. And that included tours in both wars, teaching at West Point and all of this. However, in real life, right, not on paper, moving towards activism, writing, and scholarship that opposes the obscenity that we're talking about here, that opposes the systemic corruption that is the military-industrial complex, is, I think, probably the best service that I could possibly give to my country, however small that is. And my last book was called Patriotic Dissent, and it hits on that. So what are the crises? You know, there's the immediate, the insurrection, the Trumpism. This is real. I mean, this is to be taken seriously. It's serious, but I think it's symptomatic. And it's symptomatic of what? Finally, the systemic. So with systemic, you've got the persistent crises, a republic devastating and liberty squelching endless war and empire, the existential, climate catastrophe, nuclear Armageddon, the things that require international cooperation rather than aggressive expeditionary hawkishness, and the military-industrial complex, corruption, cronyism, and kleptocracy that underpins and enables the whole thing. And I think that the MIC, the military-industrial complex, is hard to talk to people about because it has a hyphen. That's my theory, right? It's hard to explain things that have a hyphen. It can seem a little esoteric, but what this webinar is doing with the whole title of this is showing that this is practical, it's happening in your communities, and I'm really happy to moderate this and to, you know, introduce a range of speakers. And I'm not going to give long bios. I think our speakers kind of will tell us a bit of that in each of their own remarks. But, you know, leading off, talking about the local, talking about how foreign policy and the military-industrial complex is not a thing that happens just in Washington. We have Middletown, Connecticut's mayor, Ben Florsheim, who was elected in 2019, the youngest mayor in city history, also a former aide to Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who, you know, I followed for a number of years, largely impressed with his activism on Yemen and the blockade, the starvation, and the bombing there. So with that, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker.
Great. Thank you, Danny, for having me. Thank you, Steve, for the invitation and for putting this together. And you're right, we're here at a very timely moment, and I'm really glad. As horrifying as this week was, I'm really glad that we are together talking about the path forward, not just sort of circling the wagons about what has happened, but trying to articulate in our state and in this movement how we can build a better world. And I think that is a really important conversation to be having now also because of the climate locally in my community, the climate in our state, and the circumstances that we now face at the federal level. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk just a little bit about, is just the nexus of those things. I've had the opportunity to work for varying amounts of time at state, federal, and local levels of government. And the important thing across all issues, it's really important to, I think, understand how those different layers of power and different layers of government interact with one another, but no more than this one, because it is so easy to take for granted or to assume or to be, you know, lulled into the belief that what happens in foreign policy and what happens when it comes to the military and war is totally disconnected from the things that we deal with in local government. The repairing potholes, running local health clinics, the stuff of local government seems completely divorced from what we're doing overseas and what we're doing when it comes to foreign policy and military policy. But of course, we're here today because we know that that's not the case. We know that it's more complicated than that, and we know that we need to disentangle that if we're to be able to carve a path forward. I live in Middletown. I'm honored to serve the people of Middletown. The section of Middletown I live in is down the street from a large Pratt & Whitney facility that makes both commercial airplane engines and military plane engines. It's a big part of the local economy. It's a big part, frankly, of the regional economy. It is one of their major facilities in the United States. It is an economic driver for the region. And I think that it is sort of just because it is the site where they produce not just military equipment, not just commercial passenger equipment, but both. It is sort of an example of how we should think about this issue. And I think that the thrust of the conference today, of the webinar today, is talking about what we could be doing instead of spending millions, billions, trillions of dollars on our military budget and on our overseas adventures, and how we can not just rethink foreign policy, which was one of my old boss, Senator Murphy's priorities, and must continue to be a priority in Washington. Not just rethink what our presence in the world should look like, but rethink what our country can look like if we reprioritize what we're spending money on, what we're talking about in Washington, and what we sort of take for granted as essential and not. And that was a big part of what we've been seeing in Washington over the past several months. We saw just a couple of weeks ago the fight over $2,000 survival payments from the federal government. And there was a group of senators led by Bernie Sanders who said, we are not going to take a vote on the $750 billion military budget, the budget that passes every year as an essential vote. I learned in the Senate that if you want to get things done, if you want to get legislation passed, the best way to do it is to attach it to one of these omnibus spending bills. And the best one to get it into is that defense authorization bill, because it is the most essential piece of legislation, according to Washington, to make sure that it gets through every single year. Usually there's no debate whatsoever about it. And it was considered an extraordinarily radical step in Washington to put a hold on that bill. Any individual senator can do what's called a hold, to sort of put a hold on that bill in order to use it as leverage to start getting some domestic priorities straightened out, starting with making sure that people are getting the dollars that they need to survive in this pandemic. We know how that ended. We know that didn't pan out. We know that there was a bipartisan consensus to defeat that delay and to hold the vote on the defense authorization bill without voting on $2,000 checks. We also know that since that happened, the balance of power in Washington has changed. And that's another reason why I think it's really important that we are here talking about this today. For the first time in over 10 years, we're going to have unified Democratic control of the federal government in Washington, which represents an opportunity, and it represents, I think, an obligation for those of us in the progressive movement, because as important as it is to have defeated Trump, we have not yet, as we saw on Wednesday, we have not yet defeated Trumpism. And we are not going to without a much longer and much more serious fight. And we have an opportunity with Democratic control of Congress and the presidency. But we also know, those of us who were paying attention at the time, what happened the last time there was a Democratic trifecta in Washington, D.C. We got compromises on domestic policy. We got continuation in many respects of our mistakes and our failed priorities overseas. And we got a very short-lived electoral majority that went away as soon as there was a next opportunity for the people to vote. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that Democrats at the time were not providing the right alternative, that we're not providing a clear alternative. We're not articulating why on domestic and on foreign policy they were a better option, and the people sort of spoke accordingly. I think that it is a positive thing that Democrats are now talking again about, to some extent, they're talking again about material politics, about what the costs of things are, and how we can try to get those dollars and try to get some support back to our communities. That has only sort of happened, I think, because of the depth of crisis that COVID-19 has shoved us into. And I have, at the local, in local politics, the reason that I wanted to sort of switch from the federal government to local government is because I felt that was really where you could make the biggest difference to what's going on in your community. It's where you can have some more control over small projects that make a big difference. But it is also, when you have power at the local level, it's just enough power to know how little power you really have when you're in local government and trying to operate in the framework and within the structure that exists in our country. And I have had the conversations with my constituents over the past year as we have worked our way through this crisis. People who have said to me that they have to make a choice between quitting their job, leaving their livelihood, or taking care of their child, that they weren't making enough money to put their child into daycare in the job that they're in. And so they were going to have to find some way to make that balance work. I've had to talk to people about who have lost their homes and who, we have tried at the local level and I think succeeded relatively to a lot of our other communities in providing small business relief, in providing emergency housing support, in making sure that we are looking out for our most vulnerable residents during this crisis. We're fortunate in Middletown that we are, unlike a lot of cities and towns in Connecticut, we're in financially pretty good shape. We have the resources to tap into to try to keep people from falling through the cracks. But we are one community of less than 50,000 people. We have obligations that we need to meet that are going to mean that we can't do everything at the local level to keep people's heads above water. And as this pandemic and its effects on the economy, and frankly, it's a culmination of economic trends that we've been seeing for many, many years, as more and more people are struggling more and more to keep their heads above water. We know that we need more than just a series of localized responses. We know that we need to be making the case for a change in priorities at our national government, away from war making, away from empire building, and towards meeting human needs. And I think that it is important, and this is why I'm glad to be here today, that more local leaders and state leaders are brought into this conversation, because again, we're the ones who are having those one-on-one conversations with our constituents. We're the ones who are seeing up close the consequences of the policy decisions we're making in Washington. When I was in Washington, when I was working in the Senate, I didn't spend a lot of time in Washington. I was mostly here in Connecticut trying to sort of bridge the gap between what we were doing in Senator Murphy's office and what was going on here in the ground in our state. Now at the local level, I'm even more directly plugged in to what our constituents are going through, what our residents are going through, and it's not unique to Middletown. It is something that I think needs to be a unified voice that we're speaking with as local officials and as state officials, trying to raise up the stories and the challenges that are presented and tell our elected officials in Washington. And we're lucky, again, to have folks like Senator Murphy, like Congresswoman DeLauro, like Senator Blumenthal, who are sympathetic, who are going to listen to us, and who might not always agree on every point, but are going to give a good hearing. I think that the way we get a better hearing is to make our voices heard in larger numbers and to make sure that we are telling the stories of our constituents and our residents that are struggling, and that we have a choice, and it really is a choice as to where we put our priorities when it comes to national policy. This is the future of the United States, in my mind. If we have a future as a country, is not going to be in continued empire building. It's not going to be in continued warmongering throughout the world. It is going to be starting to focus after a long period of moving away from programs like the New Deal, like the New Frontier, like the Great Society, and towards privatization of social services, towards spending all of our federal budget on militarism. We have to change our priorities if we're going to have a future as a country. And I think that the way that we can try to bridge that gap going forward is making sure that those elected officials, and certainly not just elected officials, but I'll just speak for the little role that I play as an elected official, that we are engaging in numbers to try to tell those stories of our constituents, try to share with our federal representatives what our priorities really should be, and to do everything that we can to move the focus away from what we're doing overseas towards trying to do nation building here at home, trying to make sure that we have healthcare for everyone here at home, trying to make sure that nobody in the wealthiest country in the world is dying because of circumstances inflicted by poverty, inflicted by a pandemic, inflicted by circumstances outside of their control. And we know it's achievable. We know that it's doable because it has been done in other countries. It has been done in many ways in the past in our country. It wasn't always this way, where things were so out of balance in favor of military spending and building empire, and not focused on basic human needs in our cities, in our towns, in our communities. And right now we have an activated, I think, a motivated progressive movement that needs to make sure that it's working in unison, speaking with a united voice to this new Congress, to this new president, and telling them that the way that we build power, that is going to be durable, that is going to be sustainable, that is going to last as a progressive party and as a progressive movement, is to support those basic human needs, is to give people who are struggling what they need to survive. And in order to do that, we are going to need to reorder our priorities in Washington. But the good news is that it's to everybody's benefit that we move in that direction. It's to everybody's benefit that we move away from the direction of endless war and endless empire building. And I'm just excited that this conversation is happening here in our state. I'm honored to be part of this panel with this distinguished group. And I think it's really important, again, that we are not quiet at the local level, at the state level, just because this seems like it's happening far away. It is affecting our communities and our residents every single day. I'm proud to be here to make it a priority. I'm looking forward to the discussion that is going to ensue, and I'm looking forward to working with this group in the future to make sure that our voices are heard at the state level and in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor, for your comments and for your work and prioritization at the local level, doing that rare thing that is becoming a little more common, which is to connect local issues to the broader national, global, and systemic. And I think that's important. And I really like the use of the word priorities, and the local application of that old but ever valuable adage, live your values. And, I've been lucky enough to learn how local some of this is, doing work with drone, against drone bases in Iowa, or, being in Massachusetts and working one day on Chelsea Manning, which is a big, broad issue. And then the next day, local Raytheon and, anti-Yemen war activism there, which of course, Senator Murphy was great on. So I think the question that you raise is, what sort of a society and a nation do we want to be? And most people are with us, and it's the politicians in Washington and the duopoly largely who are often out of step. And we have to remember that decency, liberty, fairness, and justice are really not compatible with empire and militarism. And it filters all the way down to medium-sized American cities and local communities. And so with that, I want to transition to our keynote speaker, Richard Wolff, who frankly is someone that I've not met or spoken with, but that I've admired for quite a long time in a very real sense. Someone who, as a scholar, has at every turn, to my mind, re-injected like a class analysis into discussions of all kinds of issues, especially these, at a time when that's kind of out of fashion, right? Especially after sort of the new Democrat wave and the neoliberalism. And I think it's really important. So Richard Wolff, of course, is a professor of economics emeritus, founder of Democracy at Work, and the author of many books that are sitting on my shelf right now and long have, including The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. And the thing about Richard is there's this old concept that seems to have gone the way of the dinosaur, of the scholar as practitioner, living values and contributing according to his ability. And so with that, sir, I'd like to give you the opportunity to give your remarks.
Thank you very, very much, Danny. I appreciate the invitation. I lived most of my adult life in Connecticut, so I have a special feeling also for the issues of militarism and budgets because of the history of the state of Connecticut that I looked into when I was a student and when I lived there and worked there over the years. So the question that was posed to me for my presentation was framed as kind of having me imaginary being an advisor to the new President Biden, which, let me assure you, I am not. But to do this in an imaginative way, what would I tell him about the defense budget that we have and the economics of it, and what a transition would have to do to get beyond it? So I'm going to be very brief about the problem and focus more on the solution, since I would assume that most of you know what the problem is, but a couple of overview statistics might help. For many, many years, decades, the United States has spent much, much more on what it calls defense than any or all of the other countries with which it might ever engage its military. The way the statistic has been developed most often is to point out that the United States alone spends more on the military than the next 10 countries in the world. And those include Russia, China, etc., as well as Britain, France, and so forth, Japan, and so forth. So we are an outside spender on the military. And what that means is not the stuff you already know about militarism and colonialism or neo-colonialism or empire maintenance. I won't even talk about the thousands, 1, 2, no one exactly knows, of military bases that the United States funds around the world. No other country has anything remotely like the network of global military bases. And certainly our ostensible enemies, Russia, China, and so on, do not. The Chinese do not. The Russians do not. That's the reality. You don't hear about it very often because it immediately raises the question, why? Especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union way back in 1989. And then we had no ostensible enemy, and we don't really have one now either. What is the issue? Well, I think here's the economics. Not that there's nothing to the maintenance of a global empire, there is. What the United States does is make the world a special place for American enterprises and for American economic interests to prevail. And I don't want to deny that or shortchange that. But I don't think that's the basic economic benefit that defense, militarism, the military provide to the United States. So I want to focus your attention on what the military budget does here in the United States to the US economy. I believe this is the most important element. I believe this is why military budgets are as large in this country as they are, why they get overwhelming support each year, as they did this year a couple of weeks ago. The money is always there for the military. There may not be enough to give unemployed people $600 instead of $300 extra during the worst pandemic in a century. There we are worried about money. Or maybe helping cities and towns with budgets wrecked by the fact that we have 20+ millions of Americans unemployed, therefore not earning, therefore not paying taxes. Cities and towns are desperate. The Congress of the United States worries about the affordability of helping them. And ditto with food stamps but when it comes to the military, I am assuming many of you know that it is not at all uncommon that the military submit a request and that the Congress of the United States allocates more money to the military than they requested in their budget. That is not a rare occurrence, happens all the time. So what is going on here? Well, the way to get into that is to make it clear to people that for many, many years, there has been a reality of the American economy that has been systematically denied ideologically. In other words, and we all know this from our personal lives, it is not so strange that people who do something act out when they speak as if they would never in a million years even think of doing it. And then we discover, if we look far enough, that they have been doing it. In other words, denying it in words is sometimes the best way to manage the fact that you're doing it in deeds. And this is the way it works with our economy. The ideology taught in the university, and I'm an economics professor, I can tell you that that's what we teach. What is going on in the university? What is going on in the mass media? What you are told by leading politicians of both major parties is that we are fundamentally a private capitalist system. In other words, businesses, whether they are factories, offices, or stores, are basically in our country run by private individuals, people who have no position in any state apparatus. The enterprises are private enterprises, free of government control, free enterprises, private enterprises, and that's the basis of our economy. And that we have a debate between Republicans and Democrats over the little bit of regulation, maybe, that the government does, or the little bit of intervention with taxes that the government does. The Republicans want a little less, the Democrats happy with a little more, but all of them understanding that the government is a far inferior player in our economy. That's what we say, but that has never been true. And we say it in no small degree because it's frightening to all kinds of interests to admit what the reality is. So let's begin. The government, especially if you group together federal, state, and local, but even if you didn't, the government is probably the largest consumer in the United States. The government is the largest single employer, for sure, in the United States. That already means that the government plays an outsized role in our economy. But let's turn particularly to the military. The budget this year, roughly $750 billion. Now, let's be very clear. The government then is just shy, and I say only just shy because what is public is the $750 billion. There are more billions, but they are kept secret because of budgets of the CIA and others that are not reveal these are said to be national security issues, although let me assure you that our positive enemies, to whoever they may be, make sure to know those things, just as the United States makes sure to know those things about the other country. So it's really keeping it from your own people. Your adversaries, they have their ways, they always have. But let's stay with the official numbers, $750 billion. Now, to think that an economy like ours, roughly $20 trillion, and we're talking about a government, just the military alone is almost $1 trillion. You add everything else the government does, the roads it maintains, the harbors it maintains, the walls on our southern border that it builds. You add up the Social Security it spends out, it's in the trillions of dollars, as you know, which means we're talking 10, 20% of the spending in this society is directly money spent by the government. You could not have an American capitalism, and this has been true for decades, that wasn't in fact supported in countless ways by the government. You may not like it, you may be opposed in principle to it. I'm not addressing that. But if you deny that it exists, you are fooling mostly yourself. And tax spending is only part of the story. Then there are all the subsidies, the ways that the government finances or helps to finance countless businesses. Let me take the state of Connecticut. The most outstanding large businesses in Connecticut are either military, United Technologies, all of that, you all know about that, or things like Yale University. And I'm sure you understand that just as the defense industry in Connecticut depends on government contracts, it could not exist without those contracts. There is no private market for missiles or military jet planes or the engines that run them, etc. That's government spending. But what you may not have thought about is that civilian activity, for example, Yale University or Connecticut College in New London or Middletown's Wesleyan or any of the others, I mentioned those because those are the richest. They are subsidized by the government. They pay no income tax to the federal government, no sales tax to Connecticut, and no local property tax to New Haven if you're Yale, New London if you're Connecticut College, Middletown if you're Wesleyan. Sometimes, usually under pressure of citizens, they will make payments in lieu of taxes, but those payments are a small fraction of what they would otherwise have to pay if they were taxed in the same way that an income of $30,000 income of a 4-member family has to pay in those towns. And Yale is the 4th richest university in the world. Its endowment is in the neighborhood of 25, 30 billions of dollars. If anyone could afford to pay their taxes, they could. And since they cater mostly to the richest people in the world, there is no problem for them in raising the money that would allow them to pay the same taxes that reasonably middle-income people are required to pay. So they're subsidized. I could go on, but you get the picture. This is a government that supports capitalism. If I were a little harsher, I would tell you that American capitalism has always been dependent on the government, and that dependence has grown. And under the pressure of the pandemic, I would argue that capitalism in the United States is now so sick, so economically deprived, that it is on life support from the government, dishing out checks to everybody, enhancing unemployment benefits, making loans that are then forgiven to small businesses, much of which is taken by big businesses, as we know, et cetera, et cetera. The Federal Reserve in our country is making virtually limitless amounts of money. We've increased the supply of money in the United States by the trillions over the last 10 months, and we've been doing it for 10 years before that. And what do we charge big businesses and banks when they borrow limitless amounts of money? A rate of interest that is historically barely above zero. In other words, free money for big business, which is why banks and other big businesses are deeper in debt today. Debt ultimately provided by the government than at any time in American history, and we're not even close to the earlier highs. Now, let me get to the defense. If you wanted to make a transition out of a dependence on the military, if you wanted to say we really are going to have a defense department, in England they call it the War Department. I'll leave it to you to decide which name is more accurate. But if we really wanted to have just a defensive capability rather than what we actually have, if we, in other words, were to reduce dramatically the amount of money spent on military, we would have to find alternative ways to support American capitalism, if indeed that's what we want to do, because it cannot survive a withholding of a significant amount of defense. It needs that money. In fact, that's why the Congress keeps voting for that money. The military are smart folks. They've worked out exactly the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. There are military installations, not just in Connecticut, which is outstanding in terms of its dependence on the military, but every state has it. Virtually every congressman and congresswoman has military producers of one kind or another in his or her district. It is very difficult then for them to vote against the military for fear that the word will go out to their constituents that their dependence on military contracts for their jobs, for their profits, for the communities that depend on taxes from all of that. So they better not have a person in there who votes against the military. This is a deeply embedded system, been going ever since the end of the Second World War. That's a 75-year period. So you would have to come up with something else that could provide the support from the government that our kind of capitalism now absolutely depends on. But we have that. That's where this idea of a Green New Deal is a perfect answer. Not that it has to be particularly that kind of activity, although heaven knows our climate crisis makes that reasonable. But we don't take care of our elderly the way we could and should. We do not provide quality, safe childcare for the millions of our citizens who need to work. Two adult members of families who need to work but cannot do so unless there is proper childcare and proper schooling. That could be done now. It should be done now. We have the unemployed people who need it to be done. We have the children whose education is being lost. We have every reason to produce vast new socially distanced schoolrooms in buildings, in tents outside of buildings. Rich people in America know this. Here's a statistic for you to kind of absorb it. 5%, only 5% of private schools are now using distance learning. The other 95% are meeting with the students. They're arranging for the teachers and the students, maybe only 3 or 4 students, to be safe, to have the masking and the social distancing and the cleaning necessary to do it safely. Only 5% are doing it from home. When you go to public schools, the number is larger than 60%, 60. We are further dividing our country for years to come by hamstringing the education of the vast majority. 50 million people go to public school in this country, 5 million go to private school. 10 to 1, we are in public schools where we are doing distance learning. And with all due respect, as a lifelong teacher, that's not the same thing, and it's not even close. These things don't need to happen. There could be a massive program, testing, tracing, teaching millions of students in small classrooms, needing huge extra numbers of teachers who should be hired to be given work. And there should be the building of schools that can handle it, since we don't know what other viruses may be coming down the road, etc. Lots of important things to do. Daycare centers, elderly programs for a population that's elderly. Yeah, we will need the government to come in. And you know how we can afford it? 2 ways. 1, cut that absurd military budget. Stop trying to run the world. It isn't working real well. I follow European newspapers. In all major European newspapers, the following statement is made all the time. The United States lost the war in Iraq, and the United States lost the war in Afghanistan. We are the only country where large numbers of people don't know that, don't want to believe it, don't want to ask the question how the richest country in the world with by far the biggest military is in a situation like this. We have to persuade our people to withdraw from the military, but it's not a problem because there's lots of other things to do. And if you're worried, last point, about the financing, that the costs we save with the military, let's say we cut it in half, it's only 300 billion instead of 750 or something like that. If that isn't enough to pay for the rebuilding of America that we all need, well, then there's an obvious, equivalently justified place to go. And that is finally to tax the obscenely rich people. The several hundred billionaires in the United States have become much richer over the last 10 months, to the tune of roughly $2 trillion, at the same time that 60 million Americans had to go file for unemployment insurance for part or all of those 10 months. That's not inequality. That's going back to Egyptian pharaoh times in terms of difference. And why did those rich people become richer? Because of something they did? Absolutely not. Because of the pandemic. We couldn't go to a store, so we used the delivery service, so Mr. Bezos made billions and billions. This is not appropriate, this is not ethical, this is not necessary. And the money that could be gotten by properly taxing these folks, out of a population of 330 million, I'm talking about 600 people. They would still, after a significant tax, be the richest people in the world. But we would have the money, together with what is saved from the military, to transform the United States, to provide people with a basic job, a basic income that would do more to reduce the rage we saw last Wednesday in Washington than anything else currently being proposed by either party. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been of some interest, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. for not only important comments that focused on solutions and trade-offs, but for, as ever in your work, raising the fact that these economic issues are also ethical issues. And I think that it is wildly important when we talk about the military-industrial complex, when we talk about the hyper-capitalism and cronyism that is underpinning it, to recognize those trade-offs and opportunity costs. And as you mentioned, COVID has seemed to be a truly macabre exposure of a system constructed, as you've noted, for so long, over a long period, right before our eyes, that benefits pecuniary and professionally a tiny minority that are invested in this, in the war, in really all of Martin Luther King's triplets of evil: militarism, hypercapitalism, and racism, and it's all intertwined. And one of the things I think that has been added, that our next speaker is going to be talking about, to the pot, and it's been brewing a while, and now it is before our eyes, and it is not a long-term problem any longer, is climate catastrophe impending. And it's tied to all of this. It's tied to the Pentagon, it's tied to expeditionary war, it's tied to the hyper-capitalism that we were just talking about, this obscene system of profits for few. Adrian Huq is proof, though she doesn't need me to say so, that the youth, in many cases, has the most skin in this game, in the climate game, in the anti-militarism game, and in the obscene economic inequality that's tied to all of it, because their future is on the line. And the question that's really raised is, will they have grandkids? You know, is that a possibility? And I think that goes beyond hyperbole. The future is on the line, and we do well to listen to their voices and assessments. And so Adrian Huq is the co-founder of the New Haven Climate Movement's Youth Action Team. She is a 2020 graduate of New Haven Schools, a volunteer at the New Haven Peace Commission, tying these things together. And in her work regularly, as I was doing my research and getting inspired, which is always a great thing, she's pressuring city and business leaders not to ignore the climate emergency amid the pandemic response. And it's important to note on this climate issue that even the Pentagon, at least until Trump put some pressure to remove the terminology, which the Defense Department being the biggest polluter, right? One of the great polluters on the planet, but even they, for their sins and for their practicality, sometimes had to recognize that climate change is real. And I think that's instructive as we have a nation that largely sleepwalks to catastrophe. And there's no issue and the sort of activism that Adrian does that more links the local to the national and the global. So I look forward to your remarks, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for introducing me. I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm going to be sharing my screen. I do have a slideshow to share with you all. So just 1 second there. All right, so first I would like to start with just introducing myself and who I am. So as previously mentioned, I am the co-founder of New Haven Climate Movement's Youth Action Team. I'm also a 2020 graduate from New Haven Public Schools, and right now I'm a freshman at Tufts University, and I'm studying environmental studies, unsurprisingly. And so with the Youth Action Team, I've been with them since 2019. And the New Haven Climate Movement is a grassroots organization of New Haven area residents, and our youth team consists of mainly high school and college age students. And together we push for strong action on climate change from the New Haven city government, and we mobilize residents and local organizations to learn about and act on the climate emergency. And we fight for government policies that will restore a safe climate and a just future. And also, since this is the Connecticut Peace Conference, I want to bring up that the climate crisis poses unique challenges to New Haven and Connecticut as a whole. Sea level rise and storm surges endanger people and infrastructure in our coastal communities and along Long Island Sound. New Haven is already home to countless climate refugees fleeing from their homes in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And so we believe that New Haven must take immediate action to address this emergency, and we support prioritizing equity and justice in our solutions. And the reason I got involved in this work was that I am very, very terrified of business as usual, with the amount of consumerism we partake in the first world and the waste we create in the United States. And just for a little bit of background on things that we've been working on, we push for a Connecticut Green New Deal. We're mobilizing state senators to back a Connecticut Green New Deal with a focus on how our shoreline communities are impacted. We have an electric future committee that's working with the New Haven city government to push for electrifying more of our buildings and moving away from fossil fuels. We have a climate education committee that's pushing for climate change and climate justice education in New Haven public schools. And we have a campaign for pushing a climate justice and green jobs fund, and for the city of New Haven to contribute $1.1 million to invest in clean energy jobs creation, energy efficiency outreach programs, and transportation improvement. And one of our main successes has been passing the Climate Emergency Resolution in 2019, which called for zero emissions from the city by 2030, and equitable outcomes for marginalized communities, as well as establishing a city task force to work on the climate crisis. And so we had a really busy summer of outreach and public actions with the fresh energy that this new youth team brought to the movement. And it was unanimously passed by the alders in August 2019. And just as a little bit background on other successes, we've been able to pass the New Haven Climate and Sustainability Framework in 2019. As I mentioned, this Climate Emergency Resolution in 2019. In 2020, we actually got the city to commit $550,000 into capital funding towards climate infrastructure projects, as well as $50,000 in their general 2020 budget towards climate solutions. So that brings us to a total of $600,000. We also have a parallel project called CHEP, short for the Climate Health Education Project. And I've been facilitating their high school internships since 2018, where we recruit students from different New Haven area high schools and work with them to advance climate change education in their schools. And of course, through the years, we've mobilized our community and our youth to act on the climate crisis. And now this brings me to my peace advocacy and how I got involved in this fight. So actually the chair of the New Haven Peace Commission reached out to me last year on if the New Haven climate movement would endorse their referendum that they were pushing to be put on the New Haven ballot regarding if Congress should transfer funds from the military budget to cities for human needs, jobs, and an environmentally sustainable economy. And once I saw that, I was definitely on board. I got New Haven Climate Movement to sign on, and since then, I've been involved with the New Haven Peace Commission. And the referendum was very successful. 83% of people that voted on the referendum chose yes. And really, after learning what the federal military budget looks like and how it clearly prioritizes militarism over the quality of life for our residents and, of course, the environment within the US, it really became urgent to me that we must mobilize to change our reality and defund the military. And so I'm pretty new to this peace movement, but I must admit that peace advocacy deserves so much more recognition. I definitely don't hear too much about this movement when I believe it should be important to anyone that sees an issue with killing people and with funding destruction of our world and communities abroad. And the truth is that funding trillions of dollars into the military to wage endless wars and establish dominance has prevented us from investing in true security and services for our people in the US. So now I want to go over some really key points about how the climate crisis is related to militarism. So first, it is the US Department of Defense is the largest single producer of greenhouse gases in the world. So unsurprisingly, the US militarism degrades the environment and contributes directly to climate change. And according to a recent study from Brown University, the US Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum. And so correspondingly, it is the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. The US military produces about 59 million metric tons of greenhouse gases annually, which is more than entire industrialized countries such as Sweden. Next, control over oil causes wars. So oil is the leading cause of war. An estimated 1/4 to 1/2 of all wars since 1973 have been linked to oil, and the US is not exempt from fighting wars for oil. The vast military infrastructure around the world is also strategically positioned in oil and resource-rich regions and along shipping lines that keep the fossil fuel economy in operation around the globe. And by far, our greatest militarization has been in the Middle East, where more than half of the world's oil reserves are also located. Next, also unsurprisingly, military infrastructure and equipment has a huge carbon footprint. So maintaining an expansive military requires significant investment in carbon-intensive infrastructure and gas-guzzling equipment. And there are 800 US military bases in 90 countries and territories across the globe. And so the associated carbon imprint is tremendous. Next, of course, the act of warfare is carbon intensive. Warfare itself, the United States military has emitted more than 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the present era of American conflicts beginning in 2001. Next, all of this definitely ruins the health of the environment and the people that are living there. US military operations wreak havoc on the environments where it rages war. Also, most of the bases store large quantities of weapons, explosives, and other hazardous waste, and nearly all of them contain toxic chemicals. In the United States alone, there are tens of thousands of polluted sites linked to military contamination, and that is not even including the toxic legacy that's left behind in sites where there's little accountability or oversight. And an example of that is the burning of military waste in Iraq contributed to a widespread poisoning of the environment, and it's linked to elevated rates of cancer and birth defects, described as the highest rate of genetic damage to any population ever studied. Next, as we know, we have an overinvestment in military, and that means there's an underinvestment in many, many other social issues, and that includes climate action and humanitarian aid. In 2020, military spending accounted for 54% of all federal discretionary funding, which is a total of $756 billion. And by comparison, the budget only included $2.7 billion for energy efficiency and renewable energy, meaning the military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than for energy efficiency and renewable energy. Also, for every dollar spent on diplomacy and humanitarian aid in 2020, the US spent $16.65 on the military. And so this underfunding of aid and diplomacy has terrible implications for the climate crisis, since it is a global problem, and climate justice depends on international cooperation and helping other countries out. And compared to the $6.4 trillion spent on war in the past 20 years, the cost of shifting the US power grid to 100% renewable energy is estimated to cost just $4.5 trillion. So we could have shifted off our country's fossil fuel reliance with money to spare, but instead we chose violence and destruction. Next, climate change brings along the prospect of even more conflict. So this is somewhat of a feedback loop. Climate chaos in turn leads to massive displacement, militarized borders, and the prospect of further conflict. So to map that out, warfare contributes to climate change, and then the unrest that comes about afterwards can cause even more wars and even more environmental damage. So if we don't transform our society now, we'll face even more injustices and more conflicts in a climate changed future. And lastly, I wanted to tie this into workers' rights. Extractive and militarized industries trap and exploit workers. So I wanted to make this link because the exploitation of workers is directly tied to the exploitation of our environment. And just as with extractive industries such as the fossil fuel industry, militarized industries such as weapons manufacturing create economic dependence. And some communities lack that economic self-determination and unfortunately have their future tied to the well-being of this industry. And the military is the only major federal jobs program in the US, and it has long preyed on low-income people and recruiting people who lack other options or have significant debt and instability. So the climate crisis must also address the absence of jobs that would come about by defunding the military. But luckily, Funding a green economy instead of a bloated military budget would be a net job creator. For the same level of spending, clean energy and infrastructure would create 40% more jobs. So next, this brings me to where we go from here. So first, I want to mention that we should reject the notion of greening the military. There was recently a proposal about trying to make the US war machine more fuel efficient, but that misses the point entirely. Aspirations of carbon neutrality could promise fuel efficiency, but it does not make the United States military any less violent or any less oppressive, and we can't go forward with an extractive economy that is harming both people and the ecosystems. So to change the direction of our country, to move the money from military to human needs, repair the climate, and build infrastructure, we should, 1, support a wealth tax. It's estimated that enforcing taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street could yield $866 billion annual revenue. And with that money, there are so many possibilities that we could use to uplift our people, including investing in climate solutions. Next, supporting anti-capitalist efforts are important. We need to keep in mind that it's the same capitalism that extracts finite resources, generates pollution, and exploits communities and workers is the same militarized system that profits off of war and violence on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Fighting against capitalism is definitely a long and hard fight, but it's important because a change in our system can alleviate a lot of the oppression of people and the environment that we have been seeing for a long time and that we are especially seeing today in this pandemic. Next, supporting a Green New Deal. Among the most ambitious proposals to address the climate crisis and many socioeconomic issues we're facing is the Green New Deal. And some of the things it calls for are net zero emissions globally by 2050 and the United States before that date, and around $16.3 trillion of investment over 10 years to really rebuild America and become more green. And so cutting military spending could at least fund a significant portion of the Green New Deal. And once we adjust our spending priorities, we have so much to gain. Our government's enormous and unnecessary military expenditures have just warped our sense of what's possible. And it's made us believe that we can't afford to make our planet livable, that we can't afford to improve our lives. And so when we take back our resources, we can reinvest trillions of dollars back into our communities and begin to repair that harm that's been inflicted on people and on the planet. And since the National Green New Deal is definitely going to take a while to go through, you can also support a Connecticut Green New Deal, and we can try to get a mobilization for that going to at least have some of the aspects of the National Green New Deal working on a Connecticut level, which would include better transportation, since that is definitely a big issue here in Connecticut. Next, we can support a just transition, because we need a just transition for workers and communities in both the military and fossil fuel sectors, which is also something that is addressed in the Green New Deal. So the just transition is a framework that was developed by the trade union movement, which calls for interventions to secure workers' rights and their livelihoods when economies are switching to sustainability. And so in order to rapidly transition to a green economy, we need to fund millions of jobs in a green economy. And next, I just wanted to share this really helpful chart from the movement generation. And as you can see on the left side, an extractive economy has, of course, extraction, exploitation, militarism, enclosure of wealth and power. And then we can try to build the new, which is cooperation, working together, regeneration. And to get to that, we need to fund solutions that are visionary and oppositional to the way that we are living now. We need to divest from their power and invest in our power and change the rules from international level, national level, and local level. So I think this is a great chart to just visualize everything that's happening and that there is a way to get to a more safe and just future for us all. So next, I want to give some recommendations I have for bridging our movements between the peace movement, the climate movement, and other social movements, as well as how do we involve more of our youth. So first, I recommend that the peace movements and any peace activists in Connecticut, we should all collaborate. We definitely have more power when we come together, like at this event. We're learning ways to move forward and, you know, hearing each other, collaborating that way. And so if we collectively strategize to meet with key politicians, such as our Connecticut representatives and senators, and voice our demands, I think that we can really bring this issue to the forefront. And next, I'd say building on youth initiatives is really important. And I'd say that youth are engaged more than ever in social and racial justice, given the age of social media. I noticed that a lot of my peers are definitely very politically aware about the news, about social issues, about solutions. I'd say we have a very aware generation of teenagers and young people. And so one of the ways that we can create more of these youth initiatives is, for example, hosting more youth contests for students to write like an essay about voicing their ideas of peace or those types of things. I actually learned about the New Haven Peace Commission because I had won an essay contest about voting rights in 2020. And then I got to know one of the members of the Peace Commission after the event. And another way to create these youth initiatives could be creating internships and community service opportunities to work with you if you have a peace organization, so you can become a draw for local students and get them involved that way. And next, I think public education campaigns are very, very important about the federal military budget, because it's just a great tool to shed light on our spending priorities. Just for me, just learning about the federal military budget and looking at the chart of literally how many pieces of the pie are going towards everything else versus more than half towards the military, that was pretty much enough to radicalize me on this topic. So definitely, I think just educating the public about this is super important to, of course, have people know that this is an issue, but also the extent of the issue and possibly get them involved in this advocacy themselves. Next is to mobilize Connecticut social justice groups together. So there's, you know, groups for any social issue that you can really find, but I don't see a lot of like anti-war focused efforts in social justice groups currently. And given that the military touches on so many social issues from climate justice to workers' rights, I think we need to cross-promote our messaging. And I think the New Haven Peace Commission did a good job with that. For example, when they reached out to other organizations to endorse their referendum, such as the New Haven Climate Movement, it allowed a lot of groups to learn about their mission and get on board, which is how I got on board. So I definitely think making those connections between our different social justice groups here in Connecticut is very, very crucial. And lastly, to reach out to Black Lives Matter groups. And so there are so many racial justice focused groups in Connecticut, and a lot of them have are youth run. A lot of students have stepped up and become activists in the last months. And so a lot of these Black Lives Matter groups are focusing a lot of their demands on defunding the police and redistributing funds to communities and services to actually ensure community safety, resilience, and well-being. And so peace groups, we have a real opportunity to fit in our messaging there for defunding the military and reallocating funds to human needs, jobs, and sustainability. And so the police budget is actually part of the broader military budget in our country. And so I think it's really crucial that we make the connection between these two forms of violence and these two ways that we're wreaking havoc on communities locally and abroad. So I think there's definitely a bridge that we can make there between defunding the police and defunding the military and really taking back our power as citizens of this country. So thank you all so much for listening. I've put a New Haven Climate Movement's website and social media, as well as the Climate Health Education Project and the New Haven Peace Commission on the screen. And this research was sourced from nationalpriorities.org, and they have a really great report recently released called No Warming, No War. I read through the whole thing. It's really great and available for free on their website, so I highly recommend. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Adrian, for, wow. I mean, I'm in the mid-range of age, and I think it's really important that we kind of challenge ourselves with like new terms and words, and sometimes people call them buzzwords, but a lot of them are really effective. And I would say that as far as like an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach that you laid out, I mean, that's as good as I've heard. And it's funny, I'm really glad we recorded this because, you know, I, like so many, you know, writer types, I'm really great at pointing out problems. And then it's a bit more difficult to, you know, it's a struggle to identify plausible solutions. So I'm glad you said that. And then I'm glad this was recorded, because from now on, when I get poked about that, I'm going to be like, I've got a video for you. And it's like 15 to 20 minutes. And it's got real solutions that are across the local and the national and all these big issues. I think that what's really important here that you mentioned about the Pentagon, the climate, the connection of all of it to the war state, and which, you know, everyone has so far spoken about, is this inconvenient and I think salient truth, which is the self-styled greatest democracy in the world, the United States, is also the largest global gun runner, and is also the largest expeditionary imperial force, maybe in history, certainly in modern history. And I think most people in their hearts, and I think this is what you're trying to reach, is like most people don't want that, whatever their political affiliations, deep down, you know, when they can get over some of their biases and being incited by leaders on either end. So I think that's a really important point. And, you know, it's important that you noted that the military is not the best stimulus program, the best jobs program. The military industrial complex, this has been disproven and deflated time and again. Facts don't always seem to sink in just because they are true. But I think that that's an important point. And it kind of leads to, you know, the work and the remarks that we're going to hear from our final speaker, Joe Jamison, who is, you know, a longtime labor and peace activist. I mean, just right there in the title, labor and peace activist. A lot of people don't connect those, right? They don't think of those two things as connected. They're wildly connected. Joe is a coordinator for Move the Money to Human Needs Coalition, which really should be the title of, you know, the next administration or any decent administration's governing plan. Like, can we make that be one of the major political parties' platform? Move the money to human needs. Boom. I mean, that's it. And so I think that's really important. He's also the former research director at the New York State Labor Council. And like Adrian, like Richard, like, you know, Ben and all of the speakers, ties these seemingly discrete activism points, scholarship points together for a systemic solution to systemic problems. So Joe, thank you very much for being here and look forward to your remarks.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Thank you for inviting a New Yorker to speak to this group of Connecticut people, mostly. And let me give a brief shout out to my colleagues in Move the Money New York City and the Queens New York Peace Council, some of whom are on this call. The title of this webinar is Moving Connecticut's Economy from War to Peace, Practical Public Actions. And my job, which I think will take about 10 minutes, is to talk about the last bit, the practical public actions. And I'm happy to report there is a practical course of action open to everyone on this call. It's to get active with, in your own city, with Move the Money to Human Needs campaign. In short, for short, we often call them Move the Money campaigns. So here's the problem. We just went through a 2020 election, and we're still seeing the dramatic events of the last few days play out. I guess that's still part of the 2020 election. But for the 2 years leading up to 2020, the gargantuan level of Pentagon spending wasn't mentioned even once by the two presidential candidates of the two major corporate parties. Poll after poll for years have shown that Americans want lower Pentagon spending. And for 60 years, Congress, a political captive of the military-industrial complex, has defiantly voted to increase Pentagon spending. So what do? How do we turn our non-issue, which ought to be a central issue of American politics, but is not, how do we turn our non-issue into a central issue? Our answer is that we do it the hard way. We begin locally, at the grassroots, and we build pressure from the bottom on a mostly deaf and blind and frankly, mostly corrupt Congress. What we are proposing is not a new tactic. The tactic we're using is not original to us. The US Conference of Mayors has been advocating this bottom-up strategy since 2017. Fearing the first Trump budget, the US Conference of Mayors unanimously proposed passage of resolutions in city councils, public hearings as a result of those resolutions, and general squawking as much as we can about how much damage to municipal services the Pentagon budget does to our cities and to its most deprived communities. We're now, beginning in May of this year, beginning to get organized at a national level. In May, a number of leading peace activists set up the Move the Money to Human Needs campaign. Its URL is moneyforhumanneeds.org, moneyforhumanneeds.org. Please make a note of that link. I'll remind you once again when I wrap up, but there is an enormous wealth of practical information there for those who want to take practical public action. Its coordinating committee includes activists and leaders of peace organizations from across the country, such as the US Peace Council, which initiated it, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Massachusetts Peace Action, Black Alliance for Peace, Christian Alliance for Peace, Sanctions Kill, Code Pink, and many others. They all share a desire to cut the military budget. And in cities such as New Haven, New York City, Pittsburgh, Denver, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and elsewhere where we're just getting started, many of us are building local, broad-based grassroots coalitions of peace and social justice organizations and nonprofits that service deprived communities to promote resolutions and referenda to push Congress to honor the majority sentiment of the US people for lower Pentagon spending and to shift the spending to our real needs. These campaigns insist that the city council of each city demand that Congress members representing the given city vote to move at least 10% of the Pentagon budget, that would be about $75 billion of our tax money, from war spending and violent policing to human, community, and environmental needs. And the priority of such new spending must be placed on the poor and underserved communities and on working people. Spending colossal sums on a bloated Pentagon and endless wars was always mad. But in the current conditions of mass unemployment and fiscal crisis and 2020's historic uprising against racial injustice, crying for new political priorities, such spending is more insane than ever. Admittedly, we've been at it since May and there are still roadblocks, including very real ones. For example, we're just getting started in LA. The COVID crisis, which is hitting LA terribly hard right now, is obviously an obstacle to organizing. But we think we can at least use this time to talk to and recruit fellow activists, to tweak the resolution we've designed for LA, to map out a strategy, to identify supporters in the city council for when the pandemic eases up, which one hopes will be in a few months. Let me talk about the underlying strategy of the campaign. Because at the federal level, because the Congress so far is simply not listening, with a few honorable exceptions, which I'll mention in a minute, because it continues to throw money at the Pentagon and to ignore the urgent need to change priorities, the whole point of our Move the Money to Human Needs campaign is to mobilize at the local level among those social sectors facing the pain of cutbacks. It is local officials who must administer the cutbacks to health, to education, and other vital social services. They don't want to do it, and therefore they become objectively our allies. If pressured by us, and if pressured by all those constituencies hurt by the coming cutbacks, local governments, already desperate for funds and now more desperate than ever, thanks to the pandemic and the lockdowns and the mass unemployment, must speak out for different and rational federal priorities. What's new and what's working in our favor is that the fiscal crisis of local government is now so acute that those who felt free to ignore us before are less likely to ignore us now. And there is a change, a bit, what seems like the beginning of a sea change in Congress, where the most progressive forces, at least, are beginning to speak up for the need to cut the Pentagon budget. Our focus has to stay local, that there are no shortcuts. Nevertheless, it's a sign of hope that objective realities are finally forcing some voices in Congress to scrutinize the Pentagon budget. In the end, it may not be reason or a noble desire for a world of peace and justice or the appeals of the US peace movement, but simply grassroots pressure and the economic crisis facing our country and the looming insolvency of state and local government that drives a still mostly reluctant Congress kicking and screaming to think the unthinkable and to find a way to cut the Pentagon budget. Most of our proposals are for 10% cut. We're just trying to get a discussion going. The most important thing is the direction of change, but important advocates such as the Poor People's Campaign and the National Priorities Project, for example, are calling for a 50% cut in the Pentagon budget. I should mention Representatives Lee and Pocan, leaders of the Progressive Caucus, who are way ahead of most of their colleagues. Last July, they proposed an amendment to the National Defense Spending Act for a 10% cut. It got 93 House votes, and Senator Sanders on the other side gathered some 30-odd votes in the Senate. True, it was not enough to prevail, but it was a beginning. More important, they've also created a new congressional caucus, the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus. All thinking people should urge their members of Congress to join the new caucus. We've been working on this. If your member of Congress was among the 93 who voted for saner priorities back in July, they should get a phone call or an email from you to urge them to join this new caucus. We can give you the information as to whether or not you're a member. It's public information, but if you need the list, we can give it to you. It will take, let me conclude with this. This has been a long webinar and you've been very patient. It'll take grassroots pressure from below to weaken the stranglehold of the weapons industry on Congress. The better forces in Congress already see the handwriting on the wall, but we cannot rely solely on a few progressive voices in Congress. They need a mass they need a mass base to back them up. The more a united anti-war movement and its allies can generate grassroots, move the money campaigns in cities around the country, the sooner a stable majority in Congress will see the need for radical change. Again, our campaign website is moneyforhumanneeds.org, moneyforhumanneeds, all one word, .org. It'll give you an idea of what we're doing and who we are. I was going to regale you with a few humorous anecdotes about what kind of lame excuses you'll get from members of your city council about why he or she can't do foreign policy. And there are a dozen others that I could tell you, but you can read some of those at our website. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers for, what's genuinely been incredible remarks that tie together, issues that are too often left just individual and discrete and unconnected. And sometimes I've noticed that various entities, various, activists, and it's hard work, end up kind of operating in their own silos and not necessarily seeing the connections. And one of the things that everyone on this call and everyone on this webinar has done is to connect those very things. We are going to do Q&A here in just a bit. I've been asked to do sort of a closing 10 minutes, and I am known for nothing if not my verbosity, and I'm going to try to avoid that. But as I was looking at the title to this and then listening to the speakers and kind of scratching out my scrawling in response, it is hard not to reflect on a few things. One, something that has been common to all the speakers has been this idea of trade-offs, interconnectivity, local, national, global connections, and what we don't get because we have a warfare state, right? A military industrial complex state that is built around, hyper capitalism and all the cultural militarism that comes with it. Now, I'm a child of the Reagan, Bush 1, fetishizing, sanitizing of the military and war era of the late 80s and early 90s. And then I was sort of a teenager during the Clinton cloaking and pretending that, you know, the US was out of the war game and that it was a time of peace, and that the only tool of war was direct invasion, when in fact there was plenty of grotesque things being done in our name. But I remember from that Reagan-Bush era, the absurdly optimistic "be all you can be" Army recruiting commercials. And man, were they good. And one of the reasons they were so effective as a soundbite and as a TV advertisement is because they were corporate ad consultants brought in by the Pentagon. This was not a bunch of majors and captains in the depths of the Pentagon. That is, I used to be one of those. That's not a necessarily imaginative or artistic bunch. So they went out into the corporate entity, this contracted way, and had this really effective slogan: "Be all you can be." Something for everyone in those commercials. You know, if you wanted to be in communications and a job program, they had, you know, a helicopter flying them to the mountaintop, and on the mountaintop they put together a radar, and wow, you can learn a skill. But if what you're into is adventure and patriotism and excitement and nationalism, there was plenty of cool gear and all of that. So something for everybody. But I think the Pentagon ought to have its own cheeky and sort of snappy motto. And I think it would go something like this, based on everything we talked about today: the Department of Defense, this is why we can't have nice things. And it's not the only reason, but it is certainly one of the primary reasons, and we do not talk about enough. What nice things can't we have? Well, how about reasonable childcare that makes gender equality a possibility, right? That could alter cultural relations and also be a way to have more decent lives for working people. Public college of reasonable cost, right? Lack of debt that cripples people into their 30s, 40s, and 50s, if not forever, like a weight, like Cool Hand Luke after you've tried to escape twice, shackled to your ankles. Safe and effective infrastructure that might not collapse when you try to cross a river. Well, we don't invest in that. That's not where our discretionary spending generally goes. And of course, healthcare as a human right. COVID exposure has been an exposure of many things, but most certainly the tenuousness of our economy, of our almost non-existent safety net, and our societal health. And all of this happening in a crucial transition between presidents, between, you know, different, I mean, just whole different ways of looking at the politics of our day. Maybe a slow move, one would hope, cautiously, optimistically, away from the simple terms that the two-party system has laid for us. And I think about another crucial transition like this. And Joseph Stalin dies in 1953 in the early height of the Cold War. And a president who was also a military man, and certainly an imperfect one, Dwight David Eisenhower, he has a statue at West Point. And my cadets used to walk by it every day on the way to my class. And I would say, you know, when you think about Eisenhower, I hope you will remember June 6th, 1944, and D-Day, and all of the wonderful patriotic stuff. But I hope you'll also remember his Chance for Peace speech, also known as the Cross of Iron speech, given in the wake of Stalin's death. That address was given on April 16th, 1953, only 3 months into Ike's presidency. And he said, and it's become sort of famous in certain circles, and I think that almost everyone on this webinar has said the same thing and taken it further. He said that every gun that is made, every warship that is launched, every rocket fired signals, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed, and that the world in arms is not spending money alone, but spending the sweat of its laborers. And he goes on to discuss what you can't have. The cost of one heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities, and on and on and on, and great, you know, analogies and some work done with the economics. But he says this is not a way of life at all in any true sense. It's humanity hanging from a cross of iron. Now, we have to be careful with the allusions we make and the analogies that we bring forth. Ike, no doubt, had an imperfect presidency, to say the least. Ask an Iranian who had their government overturned in a coup, or the same in Guatemala. That all being said, without apologizing for that, he offered a valuable willingness to doubt, and doubt alone can be a radical act, and to diagnose and perhaps to warn, especially in his farewell address. there are connections everywhere. And as a historian, my hunch is that Ike was sort of a holdover from an earlier era in some ways. You know, some of that is temporal. I mean, he graduates from West Point in 1915. You know, when his successor, John F. Kennedy, was maybe in kindergarten. And it's also regional and cultural. He grows up in Kansas when it wasn't 30 years since the last of the largely genocidal Indian wars have been fought. This is like sort of a throwback. So I think in one sense, Ike is in 1953 and again in 1961, as he gives his farewell address, he's scared a little bit by some of this technological, technocratic, government corporate hybrid state of affairs that he's been seeing develop, especially during and after World War II. And in his presidency, and in some ways, he enables it and greases the wheels for it. We should not forget that. But I think also to some extent, genuinely disturbed. And thus, maybe it's a touch naive, but I think that on some level, he meant what he said in that Chance for Peace speech about humanity on a cross of iron and the trade-offs. Of course, I don't think it's completely coincidental that the whole cross of iron imagery that he used evokes the famed cross of gold speech by William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president a number of times, populist, eventually becomes anti-World War I intervention Secretary of State, whatever his own very serious flaws. But when William Jennings Bryan would give his cross of gold speech, famously, he would throw his arms out in a Christ-like or Sergeant Elias from Oliver Stone's Platoon-like pose of crucifixion. And as I recall, Kansas was bullish a bit on William Jennings Bryan, populists, progressives, and even socialists at one time when Ike was a young boy. Anyway, since Ike's two key speeches, we've come very far off the rails. In this webinar, these speakers are building on and going far past Ike's diagnosis, trying in their own ways at local levels, different cities, different methods and tactics to do something about a situation whereby we are truly through the looking glass, Alice. We are further down the path of the grotesque that Ike mentioned. And this pandemic, of course, is further exposing that. I don't think that I'm in a position to speak for all of the people who are on this call, but I know that I'm inspired by them. And I think that their choice of dissent and activism and raising these issues is a moral one, as well as an intellectual one, because it would be obscene not to. And personally, a latecomer to the game though I am, with a lot of penance to do, I'm glad to be on the right side finally of these issues, and thus was extremely proud to moderate this event. I want to thank all the speakers and offer up the opportunity now to do some question and answer from the group, from the many participants that are on the call. And with that, Steve, I don't know if you want to introduce any of the processes for Q&A or, you know, let me just kind of handle having people give their speeches, or whether I'll read them from the comments.
Yeah, Danny, I suggest that since there's a lot of stuff in Q&A, that, you know, I think that we can take a good chunk of time for Q&A for our panelists. So Danny, why don't you pick out from the Q&A some of the questions, and I think we can get some good discussion going.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions, and most likely we won't be able to get to all of them. So I apologize to the folks who have put comments in the Q&A. If we don't get to your individual question, we'll try to hit as many as we can. I am a pot calling many kettles black by saying this, but if we can keep our answers to a few minutes, I will try to direct the question to who I think probably the appropriate answer is. And then if one of the other speakers has a brief addition, please jump in when that individual is finished. So we're going to start with the question sort of in sequence for our first speaker, Mayor Ben. Jim Brazil from the Veterans for Peace in Connecticut asked if the mayor would be willing and interested in standing up with local Veterans for Peace organizations to stand outside of the local PWA plant in Middletown, pointing out the problem with military manufacturing. And I think that the broader question is one of, you know, how does the mayor feel that, you know, his existing focus on the local and tying to the military industrial complex, how that's being done now, and perhaps some areas he'd be willing and has conceived of expanding.
Great. Thank you, Danny. And let me first say this was phenomenal. And thank you to all of these co-presenters and their presentations. I learned a lot, and I'm glad to be sharing this with you. It's an honor, frankly, to be sharing this with you. Yes, I would be happy to be introduced to whatever local chapter there is, and I would be happy to be a part of any organizing effort locally, including trying to talk about what we are doing and what we aren't doing when it comes to our local Pratt & Whitney facility. I think that something that Danny, you said that is really important in introducing Joe was talk about the fact that, again, just there's so many disconnections that with this has been really the point of this conversation. But something that doesn't get talked about enough is the link between peace activism and labor activism. And I bring that up. And Adrian also made a really important point about this idea of a just transition under a Green New Deal, that we need to make sure that we are engaging with the workforce, with the workers, on what a transition to a peace economy looks like, whether that is transitioning out of oil and gas, or whether it is transitioning out of the military manufacturing. Obviously, both of those are sort of in their own way part of the military industrial complex. And I say that because I think that really the key way, and I'm happy to be a part of demonstrations. I'm happy to try to advance this locally. And I will say, by the way, that we have, thanks to Steve Krevisky, started the dialogue about adopting a resolution locally. And when I introduced it to our council, it was something that had support, not introduced it formally, but introduced the topic. We're hoping to pass it this year. But introduced the topic to our council. There was support from both sides of the aisle, and that is surprising, probably to people familiar with the National Republican Party. But when you're a council member of any party, you recognize how tight things are. You recognize that we are living in self-imposed austerity at the local level, and we need to have the conversation about what those priorities are at the national level, so that we can start to prioritize better at the local level. But anyway, my point is, it's one thing, I think, to have politicians and elected officials. I think it's important for representation and for visibility's sake, for them to be parts of these movements. But I also think it's really key that we focus on building a strong and supporting a strong labor movement. It's a unionized workforce at this Pratt & Whitney facility. And we have a great working relationship with that union in Middletown, and we're thrilled to have such a strong unionized workforce as part of our local economy. But we also need to make sure that we get those workers and we get their unions on board with the idea that this is a conversation that is also pro-worker, and it is also oriented towards creating better, safer, good-paying jobs locally, and that it's possible to do that by moving our priorities, again, using some of that ingenuity and expertise and training that these folks have developed over the years, not towards the end of perpetuating endless war, but towards the ends of trying to build a better city, a better community, and a better country.
Thank you very much. I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer, and I'll say that for Jim at Veterans of Peace, if you want to throw any follow-ons in the Q&A, perhaps we can hit them via text in the message as well. This next question comes from Justin Piglino and is directed for Richard Wolff. Justin mentions that he's a member of the Green Party of Connecticut that Richard helped found some time ago, that he had run for Congress last year, and for Rose DeLauro's seat. And really his question centers around how many of the policies that were raised by his and by other third parties enjoy popular support among voters, but not among our representatives in the two-party system. And his question essentially is, for Richard, what role do you see for third parties and ranked choice voting in creating a more representative government than the one we have?
Well, thanks for the question. My approach to this, based on my experience, which includes, I did run for mayor of New Haven in 1985 on the Green Party ticket. I got 10% of the vote. 2 years later, I ran for the Board of Aldermen in New Haven in the 10th Ward where I lived, and I got 47% of the vote when the Republicans withdrew their candidate and endorsed me. And one of my central proposals in New Haven was to tax Yale. And it was an interesting experience for me because in both of my campaigns, it was crystal clear to me, just as the questioner says, that the support for what I was saying was huge. Yale has managed to teach the people of New Haven what it means to be exploited. Whatever you may have learned in your job, Yale has figured out ways of doing it that are genuinely creative. And I say this as a person who went to Yale. That's why I came to New Haven as a student at Yale. I have my PhD in economics from Yale. I spent some of my early years studying the economics of Yale, and that what helped make me a radical because of the gap between Yale's self-presentation and the reality, which is, if I had time, something I could tell you about and would shake you, even if you think you know how bad it is. I have to tell you, it's worse. So my reaction is we have to use each and every way of moving forward that is available. I have my preferences, but that's not really relevant. If there is a way to move this conversation forward, if there's a way to reach people, let's do it. Let's remember why we're doing it. So if we work within a third party, let's not hesitate to be honest. We have our proposals, we have our plans, but we are also committed to destroying, and I'm using the word advisedly, the monopoly operated in the political sphere of our society by two parties. We have a long history in the United States of opposing monopolies. We have an antitrust division of the United States Department of Justice in order to find, seek out, and to undo monopolies because of the conviction both parties have endorsed that monopolies are a bad thing and competition is a good thing. The only place where the two parties don't apply this logic is to themselves. They operate a monopoly, and they have erected many, many barriers to entry. It's what we call it in economics, the things that monopolists do to prevent anyone coming in from breaking the monopoly. You know, we had a monopoly of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. That was never broken in this country. What broke it were Japanese and German car companies who were not part of the political structure of the United States and were able to break it. It's been very hard, and we should say all of that. But I do not want to say in advance, don't use this way, don't use that way. That's an inappropriate guessing about what is the best way. If people will listen to you as a Democrat, do it that way. If people will listen to you as a Green, do it that way. Best of all, do it both ways, and still more. The more you do it, the more there will come a time when the people inside the Democratic Party, knowing how close they are to the people in the Green Party and so on, then they'll all get together. But they'll do so in a way that can make that third or fourth or fifth party effective. And don't lose heart here. In Europe, it is normal. In most European countries, they have more than two major political parties. And they've had it that way for a long time. Many of those countries are doing as well or better than the United States economically, in fighting COVID. In other words, multiple parties are not associated with any kind of problem. So given that we're critical of monopoly parties, And given that we can show examples of where more than two parties are a healthy, long-term, satisfactory way for people to be involved politically, then I would urge us to celebrate everybody working in whatever way he or she finds congenial to their personal life, to their interests. Go ahead, let's do it. And then as we do it, if opportunities arise for us to get together, we will find those opportunities and we will build those bridges. It has happened before in America. It will happen again.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that answer, which I think is pretty solid and gets to the core of what was raised, and sort of building on some of these same issues about how to apply pressure and how to work within and without the system and the different tracks that you're mentioning. There is a question that's directed for Adrian from Ira Brous, asking, basically saying, certain congressional representatives, using the example of Joe Courtney, have based virtually their entire careers on securing money for local defense industry companies and their workers, and asking specifically, what would your strongest argument be, Adrian, for convincing such representatives to change their campaign platforms? And if any of the other speakers want to do a follow-on on that, then please feel free to do so when Adrian is complete. Thank you.
Yeah, that is definitely a difficult one. But so I believe that, it can be unfruitful trying to get folks to change their platforms, especially if we're looking at like the Conservative Party, almost like just bringing up the topic of climate change, like some of these conservatives actually don't see it as an issue, and like if you bring up anything about it, it just like deflects because it does not meet their worldview. So it can be very difficult to convince people that maybe on an opposing side that your issue is a real thing, because they in their minds it really does not exist, and so they can't really respect that in certain cases. But in this case, you're mentioning a Democrat, and so definitely I would think for convincing representatives to change their campaign platforms, I believe, I think always just targeting politicians is a good way to go. Continuing to target them either on, social media, using the media to continuously bring up this issue and that they need to act. If you could try to get a meeting with them, I think that would be great, because overall, these representatives are supposed to be representing their constituents. And so as much as their constituents can push for something, I believe the more that we can get them to act on it. So I think that definitely it's very difficult, since of course, lobbying is a real thing. And a lot of people, have their they're backed by, fossil fuel money or by the military. And it can definitely be very difficult to try to change something they're just so built upon, even with Democrats. So if it's unfruitful trying to get a politician to change their platform, I think it's good to partner with politicians that are already on your side and see this as an issue. And building power with your allies, I believe, can be a little bit more fruitful than trying to get someone that's opposed to you to believe something else. So building power with your allies to target these issues, I'd say, could be a good way to go about this.
If I could add just a thought to what Adrian said, I think we sell ourselves short. We are coming out of a long period. It's the Cold War and the legacies of the Cold War that have made it difficult for people on the left to get a hearing, to get their ideas out there, to get a level playing field, to have a debate. But that's not because our arguments are not effective. It's because it was impossible to get on to the public space to have the conversation. That's no longer as bad as it was. The Cold War is still with us, but not in the way that it was in the 60s or 70s or 80s and 90s and so on. So I would argue to you, make your arguments. The support for the military is mostly based on no one having the courage to raise questions. That's our job. And let me give you 2 or 3 examples. Number one, it is important to explain that the vast bulk of the money that flows into the defense industry ends up as dividends, as very high salaries for the people at the top. Only a very limited amount goes to labor, and that it would be a very strange logic to justify these vast outlays when so little goes to the working class, including the people working in those defense industries. They too have an interest in making different decisions about spending money. Their jobs could be protected and should be. Their incomes should be protected. It should be clear to them, we are not attacking them. That's been the effort of the defense industry, to line up the working class to support them by telling them the story that if there weren't military spending, they wouldn't have a job. If we make it clear that's not our goal at all, in fact, the opposite, to give them more security by making it a mandated thing to provide a job as a human right, something they don't get from this year's defense budget or anything like it. That's one thing. The second thing is to be honest with people about what the effectivity is of this bloated military. We are now coming up on 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And yet we lost those wars at enormous expense of lives, of expense of injury to Americans, to the people over there. I don't know if you follow these things. The United States is negotiating with the Taliban because we couldn't defeat them. And the government of Iraq denounces the United States literally once a month now, and has since Mr. Trump assassinated that Iranian general at the beginning of last year. American foreign policy of attacking Muslim countries has meant to the world that is Muslim that the United States is not your friend. And believe me, that has as much to do with the resistance to the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq than anything else. We are funding a waste. Americans don't like that. One of the ways you got them to take away money from welfare families was by portraying, you remember, the welfare queen, somebody who played the system and was driving her Cadillac. And we all said, well, that's very exceptional. It is, but it was an effective program. Imagine what we might be able to do, being able to point, I mean, I can find for you documents produced by the United States Defense Department talking about the ineffectiveness of 20 years of war. So we don't have to go to odd sources. And if we do a good job of questioning what's being done in our name and pointing out the flawed economic arguments that are holding it up, I think we will be surprised at how many of our fellow citizens will be wondering and thinking about these issues in ways that they haven't done for 30 years.
I just want to build on very briefly what Richard said, which is so important. The military and the troops and military spending and our wars, they've become a sort of cultural sacred cow. And folks have lost the courage to criticize it. You may not touch many of these issues. And a lot of folks are scared to say what he's just raised, which is not only that have we lost all of these wars, but that one could argue, and I will, that the United States post 9/11 operations, of which I was complicit, it bears noting, were a combination of a chaos and counterproductivity machine. That is what it sowed in every single sphere the United States name was sullied, more difficult to conduct multilateral, multinational action that is necessary to defeat things like climate change. All of that was made worse, including the increase in violence, terror, you name it, around the world from our actions. And I think that that is a really important point to raise. It's not talked about enough, but it needs to. Joe, please jump in.
Just an additional point. I agree very much with what Adrian and Richard said, but I think this goes beyond simply a battle of ideas or a battle to get more public opinion on the side of cutting the military budget. I think bolder tactics that actually match our level of indignation are necessary. And we can, I look next door to my Congresswoman, and it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she's become a national political figure by primarying a rather lackluster machine Democrat. I think the tactic of primarying a politician who for decades has ignored the appeals of the peace movement, and if you can go to the public websites that show that defense corporation after defense corporation has maxed out at the $10,000 level for various members of Congress from Connecticut. And I leave it to your imagination as to which congressperson I'm referring to. It's outrageous, it's corruption, and it deserves an appropriate response, and sweet reason isn't going to do it. It's going to take a struggle for power. It's going to take bold tactics. The right would not hesitate 1 minute to use this tactic. And I think those of us in the progressive community have got to start to think about when and where that kind of bold tactic to oust those people who simply refuse to honor the majority sentiment of the people of New Haven, not just the American people as a whole, but the people of New Haven. I think we've got to start thinking along those lines. That's my outsider's unsolicited opinion on tactics. Thank you.
Well, Joe, actually, I have a follow-on here for you. Let me make sure that I have that pulled up. But one of our questioners was asking specifically for you, and let me see, wanted to know about Lockheed Martin as well. And let's see. So in general, talking about how, you know, the momentum that will or will not emerge from Chuck Schumer, who, and I'm reading this verbatim, who voted yes on the 10% cut bill, becoming the Senate Majority Leader. Diane also mentions that only Jahana Hayes voted in favor in the House, and was wondering if you also had any insights into how we could go about pointing out the impact of Lockheed Martin on other legislators.
Well, the information about contributions is public information. The Center for Corporate Responsibility, I'm trying to remember the exact name of the website, which publishes all this material by corporation, by Congress member. So you can, if Lockheed is splashing around money in the congressional delegation of Connecticut, you can find out. So that's what I would suggest as to how to answer that. One thing we're going to work on is building up this Defense Budget Reduction Caucus and getting members of Congress to join it. Because of all the tumult in Washington ever since November 3rd, and indeed through this week, and who knows how long, getting that caucus off the ground organizationally has been a bit of a problem for Representative Lee and Representative Pocan, but they've now assigned staff to work on it. So that's coming, and rounding up your better members of Congress in Connecticut toward that end would be a good idea. I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
We had another question that I'll actually kind of start with, but I think perhaps Richard Wolff would be able to also add to, and specifically talking about socialism. You know, the term, the pejorative that it is often turned into, and the way that that has, you know, kind of been used to dismiss, you know, any talk of cutting budgets, specifically with, say, you know, President Trump, kind of placing himself in the role of, you know, Obama gutted the military, of course, which is, you know, empirically just not true. And it has not been true for anybody, but there's been this narrative that really did have a resonance, I believe, with many Americans about, you know, if you talk about shifting this money from the Pentagon, then not only are you sort of unpatriotic, it's downright un-American, and even talking about things like shifting over to human needs is socialism in the broader pejorative and awful sense of the word. And the question really was, you know, how do we pull away from that? Again, as sort of a problem diagnoser more effectively than a solutions provider, although I'm always working on that. I will just say one thing about that has always interested me and perhaps, you know, frustrated me and brought out some of my petulant streak. And that is this, you know, coming from the military world, coming from the military mid-range officer world, especially among West Pointers, it always struck me how strong the libertarian streak was in economics. And there's some great libertarian peace activists out there, or at least anti-war activists. And, you know, I work across a bunch of realms, but this is interesting to me because I found that my peers, by and large, were against all forms of socialism except military socialism, right? So do not mess with their benefits. Always give them a pay raise, make sure there's never a copay and that prescriptions are free. And if you mess with any of the military socialism that exists, right? And that is, I'm talking at the applicators level, right? The actual soldiers level. Of course, you could apply that to the broader sort of, you know, forever funding that goes on for the military. But if you mess with any of their programs, they freak out. The indignation is incredible. And I would often point out, because I like to poke, well, fellas, you know, why do you deserve this? And wouldn't we want to apply this to everyone as a human need? And then often what comes back is the soldier's cardinal sin, or the original sin of the soldier that's sort of in all of us on some level. And the question is if we suppress it, and that is the sin of self-righteousness. And we would often see this idea that I deserve it because I work hard. Now, you could take that from the military context and you could apply it to a number of civilian arguments against, quote, socialism. But I think that the point I would make here is how one defines that, whether one applies it immediately as a pejorative, and whether one sees, quote, unquote, socialism only in certain areas rather than others, I think can lead to problematic arguments and solutions put forward. But that's just my initial 2 cents. Richard, I don't know if you had anything else on that. I feel like that's something you could really, in your wheelhouse.
Okay, let me try. It's always difficult because the United States is a very special country. For the last 75 years, basically since 1945, we have demonized everything having to do with socialism, communism, Marxism, and all the others that go with that. There's been a drumbeat that you really could not withstand. If you did, you lost your job, you lost your citizenship, you went to jail, all kinds of things happened to you, none of them any good. And you terrified the population over a very long period of time to keep away from that, a little bit like you terrify children not to go near the hot stove with their fingers lest they get badly burned. So my heart goes out to a population that suffered that didn't have the ability to prevent that from happening. Number one. Number two, one of the casualties of that situation was that Americans have no idea what socialism actually is, how it works, what its varieties are. They don't know what its real problems are because they've been too busy, and they are real problems. But they don't know what they are because they've been too busy living in a fundamentalist world of goodness, that's us, and badness, that's them. And when you live in that world, it becomes very hard to navigate when your world is falling apart, because you really don't know what the options are. And so you're lost. Capitalism, you know, I was born a long time ago. I've got white hair. I was born in a place called Youngstown, Ohio, which is a disaster zone for capitalism. So I know from my own history how bad it can be. But Americans are now learning everywhere. This is a system in serious trouble. I know it's not popular to say so, but if you're an economist trained to look at this system, what you see is a level of disintegration that is downright scary. And in that moment, Americans kind of get it, half, but they don't know where to go with it. And that's partly because nothing was allowed to talk about it. So let me turn then to what I think is about to happen. I think we're in a moment in which the United States is very rapidly discovering what it didn't learn in 75 years. It's figuring out what socialism is. And it's a kind of scary new process, because socialism is that kind of grandpa figure from Vermont named Bernie Sanders. Or it's a very dynamic, beautiful young woman named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Or it's people coming literally out of the woodwork everywhere, catching them up. Let me use Europe again as an example. Europe has socialist political parties everywhere, in every country. Let me tell you what the government of Portugal is. I only say it because I know you don't know it, unless you're a very unusual person. The government of Portugal, which was elected in 2016, is a coalition of three parties. They recently had an election last year where they were overwhelmingly re-elected. They're very popular. The largest member of the coalition in Portugal that governs the country is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second member of the coalition that governs Portugal is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third party that's part of the three-party coalition that governs Portugal is the Portuguese Green Party. Now, what's important is not that that's the government. What's important is that you didn't know it, did you? And you're interested people. You're sympathetic. You didn't know either. How many of you know that the coalition governing Germany for most of the last 20 years is a coalition that includes the German Socialist Party? Because Angela Merkel couldn't be the leader of Germany without the agreement of the Socialist Party. Do you know that? And on and on and on. So socialism exists, it's all over the place. We are in a very weird country that excluded it. Let me end with a personal story, because I am a socialist and proud of it. But I'm also a product of American elite education. And let me tell you about it, and I'll close. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. When I graduated from Harvard, I went to Stanford in California, where I got a master's degree in economics. I left there and I finished my education at Yale, where I got 2 more master's degrees and a PhD in economics. I'm a poster boy for elite American education. 10 years I spent in that Ivy League. 2 semesters a year, 20 semesters, one right after the other. In 19 of those 20 semesters, I never heard one word of criticism of capitalism. One semester, I had a professor who did. 19-1. You know what the message was to me and the other students? That's like a hot stove. Don't go there. Don't go. Look funny at that professor, because there's something weird with him that he would go anywhere near there. When I raised my hand and asked questions about socialism, the discomfort on the face of my teacher, because I liked my teachers, made me not ask those questions. I didn't want to make their life unpleasant. I wasn't there to be a pain in the neck for anybody. But I really learned, go run away like a frightened child. There is no excuse for that. Any rational person would know if you want to understand something, you go and you learn from the people who love it, but you also pay some attention to the people who are critical of it, and then you draw your own conclusions. An economy is no different from anything else. Learn from the people who love it. People love capitalism, great. I want to hear what they have to say. But I also want to hear from the people that are critical. Otherwise, it's not an education. It's a lesson in a fundamentalist religion, and I didn't go to college for that. That's what we have in this. That's our legacy. But the plus side, the good side, when people now raise their hands, and I do a lot of public speaking, I did until the pandemic. People raise their hands and they ask questions about socialism. When I was younger, that would always be the beginning of someone telling me, how can I celebrate Stalin? And I would have to say, I don't celebrate Stalin, and blah, blah. Nowadays, nobody asks me that anymore. Nowadays, they raise their hand because they actually would like me to explain how socialism works. And then I explain to them, well, socialism in Denmark is one thing, and socialism in Portugal is another, and socialism in Cuba, and socialism in China, and they're very, very different. And if you're going to understand this, you have to learn about that. Otherwise, you're going to ask me, what is a hamburger? And I'm going to say to you, it's food. And that's not going to satisfy you real much because you'd like some more information. And it turns out there's lots of different kinds of food. There's lots of different kinds of socialism. And you know something? When I now do that and I explain to people what socialism is, you know what the most common reaction is? Why did I not hear this before? Some of this sounds really good to me. Why did my parents didn't talk to me about it. My minister didn't talk to me. My teachers didn't talk to me. Yeah. Americans like to think censorship and government control, that's all in other countries. You know, it never was. Just like what we saw last Wednesday was supposed to happen only in other countries. It's our turn now. And that means that the audience for socialism as another alternative, a way to do better than capitalism, that audience is bigger and more receptive now than at any time in my lifetime since I was born in Youngstown, Ohio.
Thank you so much. And the idea that even what we're allowed to talk about is circumscribed is so important, and something that I think every one of our speakers has challenged. And in the interest of time and looking at the Zoom closing out, Steve, I'm going to hand things over to you for sort of a final closeout, and just again thank every one of the people who've been on this call. Of course, the speakers themselves. Mayor Ben had to take off, but sends his warm regards and how happy he was to be here. And Steve, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Danny. And I'd like to thank you and all the panelists and people who contributed to the chat, Mitch for running the technology, and Henry and others for organizing this. We got a lot of work to do, and what I'm hoping can come out of this in terms of action steps. What Joe has talked about in terms of moving the money campaigns that New Haven has done and that we can do in other places. You know, for Adrian mentioning climate change, I understand there's going to be a climate webinar on January 24th. So once we get that information, we can pass it on to interested parties. And I appreciate Richard's point about making socialism no longer a dirty word. So, I mean, I come from that kind of background myself in terms of involvement in those kind of socialist groups. I think we also realize that we're going to need to push Biden because the system that created all the bad stuff going on. In Yiddish, we'd say mishigas, hassles, aggravations, craziness, that the system, this whole corporate imperial, racist system is still in place. One of the things I saw in the questions was white supremacy, which certainly needs to be addressed. So I'm reminded of, like as Danny very well mentioned, and I appreciate his comments as well, Martin Luther King's 67 speech connecting militarism, racism, and poverty are still very relevant today. And some of you know the old song from the 60s, military madness is killing this country, among other things. So I think there's a lot we can do to work together, and I'm pleased with the turnout and everybody's contributions, and I hope we can do something like this again. And regarding Joe's point about tactics that complements, the educational aspect of Richard and others, jab the beast on different fronts, that demonstrations, protests, etc. The COVID has obviously limited what we can do, but I'm hoping that we can come out of this with action steps, working more closely together amongst our different coalitions. So we got a lot of work to do, as the panelists have well said, and great questions from the chat. So I want to thank everybody in wrapping things up, and I hope we can do something like this again. So thank you all for your good work.
Thank you for having me. And I know some people asked for the slides. I'm going to send, for people who individually asked me, I'll definitely send it to you. I'll also send it to Steve in case you weren't able to get a hold of me in the chat. And then hopefully Steve can distribute them to whoever wants them.
I can send them
I'll
to the
be
whole
happy to
list
do
of
that.
attendees.
Thank you as well. I appreciate the invitation, and I'd be glad to work with you in the future in any way that you could work out. Just get in touch, and I'm very happy that you're doing this. I see this kind of activity now all over the country. So one thing I can say in saying goodbye, you are not alone. What you are doing in Connecticut is being done all over the country. And one of the things I try to do is let everybody know how many of you there are all over the place.
Well, thank you all. And we need mass social movements akin to the 60s and 70s that many of us were part of, because I maintain that that's what's going to make a difference if we all work together and keep the fight going. Okay.
Thank you again
Thank you.
for having me.
Everybody, Aluta continua.